You could be the most creative person in the world, but if you don't connect with your audience, then your ideas get lost. And I said in my last video that I don't believe that all authors are egotistical, but definitely because the process of writing is a bit stressful and it can be a little bit like lonely, like you don't really know if you're doing things right. Just always remember that you need to connect with your audience. And I always come at it from the standpoint of acting, because acting is, if you're an actor on stage, you don't have time to think up all of these things. You have to do it right away. But as an author, you have the luxury of being able to take your time. You know, that's part of writing. If you have a writing routine, you get up at 5 a.m. to write. Well, maybe not 5 a.m. Maybe every day at 5 p.m. When you come home, you write for 1 hour or you write for 15 minutes. Definitely work into your schedule separate sessions for different aspects of your book. So developing your characters, again, is one thing. Developing your themes, developing your location. So the developmental editor is kind of like at the end of that process. It's like, how has everything in the book communicated what you want to communicate? The fiction editor is quite possibly more expensive than the nonfiction editor, depending on the book, because the fiction editor is really immersed in your book. They know all the characters, they know what your story is, they know what the themes are. They're following all of the events that happen, all of the interactions between characters, and they have to make sure that they're all consistent. And I talk a lot about the adjectives you use, because the adjectives are like a color palette. The color palette that you use can really be used as a tool to connect with your audience. Whether you're writing a nonfiction book or a fiction book, you have a choice in how you describe things. And there are a million ways to say the same thing, to say the word, to say beautiful, timeless, gorgeous, stunning, ravishing, sparkling. So all of these different adjectives create different images. Beautiful is very likely to be overused, for example. And it might be well suited for an audience that you don't want the vocabulary to be too high. But ravishing is like, it has more lust in it. It has more of like, it sucks you in. So if you're writing like more of like a romance novel, that's a place to really play up that kind of lusty vocabulary. I would say create a word bank of words that you find that you really like the sound of, but also make sure they match. It's like an outfit. Adjectives are like an outfit. They all should kind of be in a family. I kind of see it like when I was 12 and also when I was 18, I played Yu-Gi-Oh! And I took it very seriously. And actually when I was 18, I got really good. And I had this deck called the Gravekeeper's deck, and all of the characters in that deck and the other cards that were like the supporting cards, they matched the theme of a gravekeeper. So there was like different creatures that were like dead, and like everything just fit the one goal of winning with the same types of creatures. And so that kind of is the relationship that I see with the adjectives, is that they all match each other and they fit one common goal, is to create that imagery. If you have a fantasy novel, you want to use maybe more whimsical language. It depends on specifically what you're trying to convey. But these are just some tips for you to start to think about how to formulate your book so that it can be the best it can be. When it comes to fiction, developmental editing is absolutely crucial. You don't want plot holes. You don't want errors in terms of characterization, like inconsistencies. If you have a character who is French, you want them to be very realistically French. You want them to be consistent. You want them to reflect that culture. If they're a certain age, if they're 60 years old, that character should reflect those archetypes that they fit inside of. Obviously allowing room for complexity and, moral ambiguity or whatever it is that you're writing in a character. It's totally cool to be creative, but you still are speaking the same language as your reader. You want to make sure you're still speaking the same language as your reader. I'm not necessarily saying English is that language. I'm saying that you want to use common archetypes as a basis so that your reader gets it. They're like, that character is that type of person. My process for fiction editing is
who, what, where, when, why, and how.
Who. All the who's have to be consistent. You want a character breakdown. Your job as an author of a fiction book is to write your character breakdown like a playwright does, and write all the names of the people, their ages, where they're from, what's their backstory. Get really, really specific. Get as specific as you possibly can. What the subject matter is. Do lots of research about your subject matter. Okay? Like what the themes of your story are. So the developmental editor is going to make sure that those themes are accurately depicted. Where? So where is very important. If you're making something realistic, like if your book is in Minnesota, you should know what Minnesota's weather is like when it starts to get dark, the culture. If your character is not from there, but they're there, how do they interact with that? How can you show that they're not from there? There has to be scenes that take care of each of these little details, these little nuances. When? So your time period, right? You can be writing a sci-fi novel, but your time period would still have to be correct. It would still have to be something we would imagine in the year 3002. It would have to be something that we do connect with.
Why is especially important pertaining to every single element of your story. You have to justify everything. And that is exactly what the role of the developmental editor is, to make sure that every single detail in your book is justified. Last but certainly not least is the how. Okay, the character she's sassy. How are you going to communicate that? That's what the developmental editor will help you with.